Good afternoon, everyone. This is Corey from the National Weather Service. We thank everybody for joining us here today. This afternoon, what we're going to do is we're going to have a couple of folks talking to you. We're going to have Megan Jones, who is our climate expert here on station, and she's going to kind of go over what we've seen so far with the winter of 2024 into 2025, and then kind of look ahead into the rest of winter and into the spring. And then after Megan kind of discusses that, what we're going to do is have Alan Schlag, our service hydrologist, talk a little bit about drought and hydro type related issues, I guess, across western and central North Dakota. A couple of bookkeeping things up on the front side of the webinar here. We do have everybody muted, and at the end of the webinar, there will be a time for questions. What we would ask you to do, if you've got the opportunity to do that, would be to put that question into the questions box. A lot of times it's real easy to be able to see those and then kind of group questions together that way. But also, if you're not able to do that, you can always raise your hand, and what we'll have to do is unmute you, and you'll probably also have to unmute yourself. If you're with the media and you'd like to do an interview or anything like that after the webinar, both Alan and Megan are available in some capacity to be able to do that. So all you'd have to do is go ahead and call the office with the number you see on the screen there, 701-250-4495, or you can email them as well, and they'd be happy to get back with you. Also, we will be sending out the slides and a recording of the webinar after we are and everything over here to Megan, who's going to talk to you about, again, kind of what we've seen so far since October, the last time we spoke with you, and what we're seeing into the early parts of spring here. So with that, I'll hand it over to Megan.
Thanks so much, Corey, and thanks everyone for being on the call today. Before we get into the really planned content of this webinar, we actually wanted to take a second and talk about the near-term forecast. So this is more on behalf of the operations staff today. You should have hopefully gotten an email from us in your inbox not too long ago with a briefing packet talking about the extreme cold coming up this weekend. So our main concern is going to be wind chills down to around 50 degrees below zero, focus across northern North Dakota late this weekend, but those incredibly cold temperatures and wind chills are going to be across all of western and central North Dakota. Definitely life-threatening cold coming this weekend, so we really want to make sure that people are aware of that and start to take any preparations they need. Other thing to note, not too much in terms of precipitation. The one thing that was noted by the operations staff today is that there is potential for a band of snow showers on Friday as the cold front moves through. So with those colder temperatures, some wind, some snow showers leading to reduced visibility, that could lead to some travel problems as well. So we've got the snow showers, but otherwise not much precipitation. And again, focus on those dangerously cold wind chills coming for the weekend. The one good news with that, as we look at our short-term outlook, this is the 8 to 14-day temperature and precipitation outlooks from the Climate Prediction Center. You can see there is blue shading slightly across North Dakota, so a little tilt towards cold, a little tilt towards above normal precipitation, but otherwise we're not expecting that extreme cold to last too long. We are expecting that those temperatures will rebound to near normal relatively quickly mid to late next week. So that is the good news of that we're not going to be in this real Arctic outbreak pattern for too long. If you have any other questions on the short-term forecast, we can address those on this webinar as well. Just put your questions in the question box and we'll address it at the end. So now turning our attention to what we're expecting for the rest of the winter. So this is the December, January, February outlook from October of 2024. So on our last webinar, we were looking at this and talking about what it meant. On the left is the temperature outlook. So you can see that there's blue shading across North Dakota, favored for below average temperatures in that meteorological winter season. And then the precipitation outlook on the right, there was no shading at all, which means equal chances for above, below, or near normal precipitation, which means that we just weren't really seeing any strong signal in our guidance. So how have things been going so far? These are the average temperature departures from mean. On the left starts on October 1st, 2024, and then it goes till January 14th, which was yesterday. On the right is the same thing, but starting at December 1st, so the first day of meteorological winter, until yesterday, January 14th. So on the left, you can see from that October 1st through January 14th period, pretty much above normal temperatures across the state, which is not too surprising. We were pretty mild in October and November, which was what we expected with the given pattern. And then you can see on the right, as we start to look more at just meteorological winter, you do start to see that cold signal show up, mainly in the north central part of the state. And then that gray shading is near normal. So basically +1 to -1 degrees Fahrenheit, a little bit of a warm signal still extending across western North Dakota into the far south central, and then a little bit across eastern North Dakota as well. So again, just started out warm, but we are starting to see the cold weather come a little bit more as we've seen this past weekend and as we see with this upcoming weekend as well. For precipitation, similar thing. This is the accumulated precipitation percent of mean. On the left starts on October 1st, goes till yesterday. On the right starts December 1st and goes till yesterday. When we look at the entire kind of cold season, if you will, starting on October 1st, definitely dry across the area, except for the far northeast corner of the state where that had above average precipitation. But you can see in this kind of gold shading across a lot of the west and central, that's 50 to 75% of normal precipitation. And then this orange circle in the southwest part of the state, 25 to 50%, so well below normal. If we then look and see since December 1st, it is a little bit of good news where you're seeing that across the west and the north especially, you are getting into those green shades, which means above 100% of normal. Unfortunately, for those in the south central and southeast, that's where we're starting to see still sticking with that well below normal precipitation. Again, this gold color is 50 to 75% of normal. And then as you get into parts of Grant, Sioux, and Emmons counties, this orange color, that's 25 to 50% of normal. So again, much below normal for this time of the winter. Now to look at snow, since that's what people really care about in the winter. The accumulated snowfall since October 1st is on the left, and then the departure from mean is on the right. So if you're looking at the total accumulated snowfall, anything in blue shading is above 15 inches. So generally 15 to 25 inches across much of the north and into the east, with some pockets of 25 to 30. Then this green shading across the far west and the south is generally 7.5 to 15 inches. Bismarck right now is sitting at 12.3, which is about 50% of normal for this point in the season. Looking to the right for the departure from mean, a little bit of green shading mainly across the north. That's 0 to +5 inches. But then the surrounding area in this light yellow is still pretty close to normal. It's -5 to 0. So again, not quite at normal, but not too far off. You really start to see those deficits when you look out west, and especially in the south central and southeast, where this orange color is -10 to -15 inches for this time of season. So again, some places up north doing pretty okay at this point in the snow season, but the south has definitely been lacking in snowfall. So of course, the big question is, why do the outlooks look the way that they have? And in October, on our main winter outlook webinar, we did talk about the El Nino Southern Oscillation. We talked about how we were expecting La Nina conditions, which is the cold phase of this oscillation, and which gives us a pretty good hint into what we can typically expect for the winter. So the big news that actually just came out last week is that we are finally in a La Nina advisory. It has been a little bit slower to develop than we were expecting, so that has had some influence on what we've been seeing so far. But we are officially now in La Nina conditions. It is still expected to be a short and weak event. And actually the climate forecasters were commenting that on the historical records, this actually might not end up counting as a La Nina event if it does not last long enough. So we are expecting a transition to ENSO neutral during meteorological spring, which is March through May. But again, we've got these La Nina conditions right now. So what does that mean for the rest of the winter into kind of the spring season across North Dakota? Typically with a La Nina, we've talked about this before, we get a blocking high pressure in the North Pacific. We get a more variable polar jet stream that makes it a lot easier for that colder air to come down from the Arctic and from Canada directly into the northern plains. It's been a little bit more inconsistent since about 1990, but we do still typically see that pattern. The one thing to note is that if there's a weaker event, it does lower the probability that we see the expected pattern. We might still get that pattern and it might still be pretty amplified where we get really cold temperatures, but we are lowering that probability. And again, we are expecting a transition back to ENSO neutral by the spring, so a pretty short-lived event. Also interesting to note, this is the snowfall pattern during weak La Nina winters. So looking at January through March, those 3 months specifically during weak La Nina winters compared to climatology. And you can see across the northern plains, there is actually a pretty pronounced active pattern with this blue shading that's actually maximized over southern Minnesota, but you can see it all across North and South Dakota that we do see more snowfall than normal during the January through March period of weak La Nina winters. So there's been a lot of evidence, and we've kind of been thinking all along the back half of winter did have potential to be more active than the front half. And so that's still what we're sticking with for our predictions at this point. Looking a little bit further in depth at some data for Bismarck specifically. Again, we looked at this in October. We've got a little bit more data here since we're in January now. These are all the weak La Nina years since 1950. Any season with a star is right after an El Nino winter. And any season with this little caret is a transition to ENSO neutral late in the season. So again, we don't have a lot of seasons to directly compare to, which does make it a little bit tricky, but we'll go through all these columns one by one. And I'll kind of tell you what we've been thinking for each of these. So the first is obviously, when is the last the 1991 to 2020 average is April 18th. And if you look at all of these dates based on previous weak La Nina years, it's generally falling in that area. It's unlikely to be in March. That's only happened once, and it was the very last day of March. May, especially across the northern part of the state. But I think we do tend to hit a point where we really just decrease the chance of snow very quickly as we get further into the spring season. Seasonal snowfall, we talked about this in October. Not much thinking there. Again, it's pretty varied. Looking at the historical totals, it's about 44 inches or above. It's unlikely to be below that, all things considered. And we also do have these two extreme outlier seasons recently, although given the snowfall deficit that we have in Bismarck, and given that we're not seeing a real strong increase in precipitation chances, I would not expect that we'd be able to get that far, to our extreme outliers, but instead maybe in this, above average, near average, that sort of thing. As we look at temperatures, we have the winter temperatures and then the spring temperatures. Again, pretty favored to be cold or at least average. It is really unlikely that we're going to be warm. And that's where, again, it can be a little bit varied. It's never out of the question for us to be, above average when we're expecting below, but looking at the historical data, it's just not super likely that we end up with a warm spring this year. As far as snow and precipitation, that tends to be the question is, okay, we know the temperatures, but now what are we expecting for precipitation? Looking at the February, March, April snow, again, it's pretty varied. The average for those 3 months at Bismarck is 20.6 inches, and you can see by looking at this table, there are some relatively dry years in there, and there are some relatively active years in there. If you look then at the precipitation, which is in the farthest right column, you do get a little bit closer to average for a lot of those years. And what I thought was interesting is even those years where the snowfall is below average, most of the time you're ending up with precipitation that's still near normal, if not above normal. So that is one thing to consider, is that it's going to depend, especially on April, if we start to get, if we get a late April snowstorm, or if we get, a warm system coming through where we really could increase that precipitation, but maybe not the snowfall. So especially late in that, February, March, April period, we're going to be pretty dependent on temperatures. So to look more specifically at monthly temperature anomalies during these weak La Nina events for the spring. So on the left, we have March, in the middle we have April, and on the right we have May. And I thought these were really interesting to look at month by month because I think it reveals a lot about the progression that we normally see. So on the left, you can see for March, there's a very pronounced cold anomaly across pretty much the entire continental US, especially focused on that northern plains region. And you can see from the numbers on the scale that it's a pretty good cold anomaly. As we move to April, looking at the scale, the cold anomaly does decrease a little bit, but it is still pretty consistent across North Dakota and the surrounding area. Then when we get to May, it flips very quickly, where you suddenly get a pretty pronounced warm signal across the central US. So our thinking is that at some point we just kind of flip, and no matter how cold it's been, eventually it's just going to warm up. The question, of course, is going to be when that happens, if it's late April, if it's early May, what sort of precipitation makers we have in the area. That's going to depend, influence if it's rain or snow. So that's going to be the real tricky transition period that we don't quite know yet, but we're certainly going to be watching for it as we get farther into the spring season. Looking at the same thing, but for precipitation anomalies, again, March is on the left, not much of a signal there, which is not too surprising. But as we look at the middle panel, which is April, it was interesting to see that there was a wet signal showing up pretty much focused on North Dakota. I'm sure we've all, you can think about some of the snowstorms that we've had in April, and how those can bring a pretty good amount of precipitation. So again, something that is never a guarantee, but it is an interesting signal showing up in some of these comparison years that we'll be keeping an eye on. Finally, over here on the right is the May precipitation anomaly. It was also interesting to see that there's a decent widespread dry signal showing up across the eastern half of the region. You see, not showing up as much in western North Dakota, but again, that's something to note, especially with that warm signal as well. So the precipitation distribution during ENSO events, I really wanted to show this again. This is representative for western and most of central North Dakota, Climate Division 17. Looking at December, January, February precipitation on the left, there's not much of a difference between being in a La Niña and El Nino or just being an ENSO neutral. So that time of year, the ENSO phase is not going to have too much of an influence on precipitation. We do start to see a pretty significant difference on the right, which is the March, April, May precipitation distribution. And in this box plot on the right, the La Niña is the farthest right. So you can see that that has a lot of potential for much higher precipitation amounts compared to the El Nino, which is on the far left. Again, it's not a guarantee, but that does lean us a little bit towards a more active pattern is certainly possible as we go into the La Niña spring. So as we look more specifically at the coming outlooks, this is the week 3 to 4 temperature outlook on the left that was issued this past Friday. These do get updated every Friday, so look for this to be updated in 2 days. That does have below average temperatures favored. There's not much of a signal in precipitation, but as we get into February, one of the things we do look for is a much colder temperatures. So on the right is the average temperature trends for February specifically. And I think if you've talked to people across the area, everybody seems to note that February has gotten a lot colder, and the data backs that up. So that is something that we're going to be paying attention to, especially as we've been in a little bit of a roller coaster in January. The February definitely has potential, just following the temperature trends and also following the expectation of the La Niña, that there is a lot of cold potential in February. It's also worth noting that our average high temperatures start increasing after January 23rd. So again, as we get later into the season, you do decrease the risk of these extreme Arctic outbreaks, but you also, may be increasing some potential of just overall below normal temperatures. As we look further ahead to the February, March, April outlook from the Climate Prediction Center, this is the one from December. These will be updated tomorrow, actually, and I'm not expecting these to look much different at all. So generally the same expectation where we are favored for below average temperatures, that's on the left, and then equal chances in the precipitation outlook on the right. Again, they are maybe not seeing too much to skew us one way or the other, but I think we're still favoring that, a little bit more active pattern for the second half of winter. Again, similar, the March, April, May outlook, temperature on the left, precipitation on the right. You see that cold signal start to decrease a little bit as we get into true meteorological spring. You start to, especially the back half of that 3 months, you start to lose the influence of the La Niña, and then equal chances for precipitation because the climate forecasters weren't seeing too much from their end. What we also look for, again, with the March, April, May outlook, our temperature outlook is, kind of split across the state, but spring has also been cooling. Not as significant of a trend as we were just looking at for February, but that is something to consider, that you've got the long-term temperature trend for spring is cooling, and then that coupled with the cold signal from the La Niña does help to reinforce the fact that we are probably favored for below normal temperatures for that period until we get to May, where we really start to see the flip. So in plain language, just to summarize what we're expecting, temperatures overall below normal temperatures through February, March, and April. We are still likely to see these large swings as other shorter term climate features dominate. Hopefully not quite as extreme as what we've been seeing lately, where it's very up and very down pretty quickly. Then eventually seeing that transition to near to above normal temperatures in May as we kind of move out of the La Niña conditions and move into the summer. For precipitation, there is a stronger signal for near to above normal precipitation for the rest of the winter and into the spring. Looking at the current data, looking at previous comparison seasons, looking at the forecast pattern, we are expecting near to above normal snowfall across northern North Dakota and then near normal across the south. Again, the south is in a decent deficit at this point in the season, so not quite sure how much above normal we could really get without it being incredibly active, which we're not really seeing that either, but it does still look more active than the first half of the season. And again, that last measurable snow is likely to occur in the second half of April or so, especially for southern North Dakota. Doesn't mean that we won't see any snowflakes after that, but once we get too far towards the back half of April and especially into early May, that chance starts to decrease very significantly. So that is all I have from the climate front. So I'm going to turn it over to our hydrologist, Alan.
All right, well, thank you, Megan. So it's that time of the year again, everyone. It's middle of winter time, and initial thoughts on what is spring going to bring for us. We have drought hanging out in good portions of North Dakota, and yet there are still small areas where we do actually have above normal snowfall, such up in the Turtle Mountain area. So there's a lot of questions that people start formulating this time of year as to what spring is going to bring. And just a real quick reminder, you can absolutely have floods during a drought year. It is not that unusual actually to see small floods during droughts, but they are not mutually exclusive is probably the best way to put it. So we'll just dive into it real quick here. First thing I want to point out is soil moisture across North Dakota. Going into this fall, especially in western North Dakota, the soils were dry to very dry. We did have a little bit of moisture that broke some of the dry soils out in central North Dakota and a little bit on the eastern side. But bottom line here is the soils under what existing snowpack we do have, they tend to be dry to very dry. Below freezing temperatures in the fall were not that common. So we didn't see a real deep push in what we often refer to as frost depth in the soil. Oftentimes we think of frost depth as where there's actually ice in the soil, but here in this case, we actually have soils out there where they are below freezing at depth, but there's not even enough moisture in there for there to really be called a frost depth. So the dry soils, I do think, are going to exert a considerable influence this spring on the eventual runoff. But for the time being, we'll have to see how much snow and rain we can put on top of that before we get to spring. So we do have at least this in our favor right now with regards to minimizing runoff this coming spring. The current snow water equivalent across North Dakota, this is a map from NORISC. It's the National Observation Hydrologic Remote Sensing Center. So we look across probably the southern 3/4 of the state, right? There is less than an inch of water equivalent in the existing snowpack across most of that region. It's not until you start getting up around those 1 or 2 counties nearest the Canadian border where we start seeing significant water equivalent in the existing snow. And so in particular, you look right at the very center of the image, the Turtle Mountain neck of the woods. There we have perhaps 4, maybe even slightly above 4 inches of water in the snowpack already. And then a little bit as you go farther east over towards Langdon, you look up into Canada, those boundaries that you see, squiggly lines, those are watersheds where we see the spring snow melt in that area drain down into rivers in North Dakota. For example, the Service River there over in southern Saskatchewan, and over on the eastern side of the state where you see the heaviest snowfall up in southern Manitoba, that's actually the Pembina River watershed over there. So there is the potential for at least some minor flooding going into spring, but it's going to be probably at this point mostly limited to the very northern tier counties of the state of North Dakota. So then let's look at the mountain snowpack. We see we don't have much on the plains, but if we look out at the mountain snowpack, in particular that which drains into the Yellowstone and eventually the Missouri River, goes into Skakawea and then comes down through the Bismarck area. What you're looking at here is a pretty standard image if you've been following me over the years. This is produced by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and the quick way to look at this is the colored or shaded blue area. That is where we stand today. And then the green, that's the minimum we've seen over the last roughly 30 years. The red is the normal or the average over the last 30 years. And then that upper blue, that is the maximum that we've seen during the past 30 years. So that's quite a bit of information in one graphic here. And what it is safe to say right now is we are running below normal throughout the upper Missouri River Basin watershed. That includes the Yellowstone and everything above Fort Peck. So not a big threat right now looking at the Missouri River through North Dakota. And in fact, some might say that this is a little disconcerting if you're concerned about not getting enough runoff. So for the time being, if you're a skier, maybe not quite the best conditions out in Montana. So the spring flood season, well, obviously is still way too early for us to have much certainty. The dry soils and the currently modest snow water equivalent really does minimize my expectations for widespread spring flooding. It will take a fair amount to get up and over that threshold that gets my attention. Importantly, it is not that unusual though, as Megan has already been discussing, for the second half of winter, and in particular this winter, for us to have expectations that it might be wetter and cooler than normal. Drag it out into that latter part of March, maybe early April. So we do have the potential for extending our snow accumulation season to help us bring more water equivalent on the ground. So I'll just say snow water equivalent at the onset of most spring melt seasons, if you have about 1.5 to 2.5 inches of water, generally speaking, I call that normal. Notable spring flood years, 2009, 2010, and 11, if you remember those, they generally had between 4.5 and 6+ inches of snow water equivalent on the ground before the onset of the spring melt season. So we are a long ways away from being able to say that we have significant threat in the snow water equivalent out there right now. But I do think it is reasonable, given the La Niña expectations for cooler than normal conditions going into and through portions of spring, that our snow accumulation season will be longer. That means I think we have, even with the general lack of snow out there right now, we're well within reach of getting to that near normal snow water equivalent by the time we reach the onset of the spring melt season. So there are some drought concerns out there. As you will notice, this image is remarkably similar in some ways to our soil moisture maps. This is the current U.S. Drought Monitor depiction of the conditions across North Dakota. Now, what I will say about this is that because we are in winter, and winter does oftentimes hit the big reset button, much as it did last spring, we were widely under some slightly lower drought designations last February and March. But then as we went into April, we received bountiful rainfall, and most of the drought considerations went away until we were in the second half of summer. So we've rebuilt these drought designations through the second half of last summer and on through the fall. And now that we're in the cooler weather season, not much is taking place. we're kind of in suspended animation. So I don't expect this map to change much over the next couple of months. It will probably be around mid-March, latter part of March, where we start getting a little bit more of a focus on what's going to transpire as the snow melts out there and the potential for rainfall in that early part of spring before we see a lot of change in this map. So in summary, with regard to hydrology, each passing week and storm right now, they will absolutely change my perception on what our outlooks will look like going forward. Okay, a single given storm, if we were to get something that brings in 20 inches of snow, obviously that changes the snow water equivalent and my understanding of what we will have available for the spring melt. So each passing week or each passing storm will obviously impact our perception and the public perception as well on what's transpiring out there. So I think it's important for us to keep in mind that starting in February 13th, will be the first release of the Spring Flood and Water Resources Outlook. Okay, this is a national effort for the National Weather Service to get out and really communicate with you, all of our partners, what we're seeing out there and what our thoughts are going into the latter half of winter and the beginning of spring. February 27th, we will update that. Sometimes I refer to it as the second edition. And then again on March 13th, that is, technically speaking, that is the final edition of the Spring Flood and Water Resources Outlook. But then a mere 2 weeks later, on March 27th, we revert back to our routine monthly hydro outlooks. And quite honestly, here at WFO Bismarck, we use the exact same format and try to put the same level of discussion in there for even those routine monthly outlooks. So this is the schedule going forward. Some of you have probably already seen this in your inbox. I sent out the schedule a couple of days ago. And like I say, that's where you will continue to hear from me on what we think are taking place as far as snow water equivalent and what the outlook for the spring flood season looks like. And with that, I guess I'm gonna turn it over to Corey and let him see what we have for questions going into the end.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you, Megan, for your great presentations here today. Right now, I'm not seeing any questions in the questions box, and I'm not seeing any hands raised. So just as a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question, feel free to go ahead and type that in the questions box or go ahead and raise your hand. And yes, Laura, that's a great question. And just a quick reminder that we will definitely be sending out the slides after the webinar here. It might take a little bit to get that all kind of organized. So what we do is we package that up with the recording of the webinar as well. So that should be sent out here not too long after the webinar, hopefully today. If not today, it'll be tomorrow probably at the latest. Also, kind of as a reminder, as Alan was saying, you know, with those webinars that are coming up, and maybe this will be a question for Alan really quick. We're not really expecting to do a local webinar with those right now, Alan. You're probably going to rely on the national webinar initially. Is that correct?
Yeah, Corey, that would be correct. For the time being, without an alarming amount of concern out there, we will withhold doing a webinar on our own. We'll rely on the national one. But of course, it's a good time to remind all of you is that if you have questions, you have my email, you've got our phone numbers. Absolutely feel free to contact me if you have a concern or a question about a given area in the state with regards to flooding.
Thank you for that, Alan. I'm not seeing any hands raised. I'm not seeing any other questions in the questions box. So I think the next thing that I'll just ask really quick for Megan here is that once we kind of get out of the spring season and we start looking into the summer, if we tend to stay on, I guess, the drier side, what do you think that could mean for our fire season? I guess that would be a question for Alan as well. Do you guys have, because I know we obviously had the fires back in October, and I think that that's probably on people's minds still. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure, Corey. I think one of the key things here is that we have a spring fire season pretty much every year. I would suggest that this year would be no different. The real question is, how long is it going to be out there without green vegetation showing up? And so that might be more of a Megan question. You know, are we going to be really cold to prevent vegetation from growing in April and early May, or are we going to kick it off early?
Yeah, I think that's going to be the big question, is when we make that flip from the cold that we are typically favored for with the La Nina and just the temperature trends in general showing cold, before we get that quick flip to near to above normal in May. So that's certainly something we're going to be keeping an eye on. As far as, you know, the rest of the summer and into maybe the fall, since we also have a second fire season, it's worth stating now that there's no real temperature signal in the really extended outlooks for the summer and into the fall. There is, if you look at the Climate Prediction Center's website for those really extended outlooks, there is a little bit of a dry signal coming in for the summer and into the fall. So of course it's very early for that, but those are things that we're always looking at far out, and then hopefully we can, you know, kind of avoid most of those problems, and we'll have to see what happens. But yeah, the switch from cold to warm in the spring is going to be really what we're paying attention to.
Looks like we have a question from Clay. This was probably for Alan. In regards to the Missouri River, is there any chance of the Missouri River ice breaking up today or tomorrow based on the warm weather that we're having right now?
So Clay, I don't think that would be a reasonable expectation. My thoughts, and I have not been up north along the river, but my guess would be that we have ice built up somewhere between all the way from about halfway between Wilton and Washburn, all down through Bismarck. And so there's just nothing in the near term forecast that provides enough 30, 35, 40 degree days for us to lose that ice. So I think we're going to be iced in for the foreseeable future at this point down here in the Bismarck area.
Thank you, Clay, for that question. I'm not seeing any other questions in the question box. I don't see any hands raised. So once again, if you do think of anything afterwards, feel free to reach out to Megan and or Alan. Again, you got the number up there, 701-250-4495, or you can send them an email and they'll be pretty quick to respond to those as well. So if you need anything else, definitely reach out to Megan and Alan, but with no further questions and no hands raised, I think we'll go ahead and end everything. So again, thanks everybody for joining us today. And again, if you have any questions, go ahead and reach out after the webinar. Thank you so much.